Cragfont. Presentation by Savannah Dalt. The Cragfont home is a monument to the stamina and triumph of the early frontiersman James Winchester and his adherence to civilized manners. However, Cragfont represents a place of hardship and tragedy for the Native Americans who fought to keep their land and the enslaved who worked there. The Cragfont home is a historical landmark located in Castalian Springs, Tennessee, and is part of Sumner County. The home was built between 1798 and 1802 by James and Susan Winchester. Cragfont was built upon a highly significant piece of land in its time because Bledsoe Creek was directly accessible and the Holston Road ran directly in front of the home. According to historical documentation, which we will discuss later, Bledsoe Creek was visible from the front porch of the home. This was important because people tended to settle near bodies of water, and this creek was rich in minerals that attracted game for hunting. The Holston Road was the only road directly connecting Nashville and Knoxville, and it is the equivalent to our I-40 today. Early settlement of the property begins with the Mississippian settlement between 800 and 1600. The Mississippian culture groups settled between 1100 and 1450 near the lick on the property and hunted game. Around 1450, culture groups relocated due to several years of drought and famine. Between 1500 and 1600, Native American groups settle. A few of them include the Cherokees, Chickasaws, and Shawnees. Around 16 to 1700, Europeans arrived and settled as market hunters. 1772, Isaac Bledsoe discovers the lick and the creek on the Cragfont property. In 1793, James Winchester buys the land after Bledsoe's death and bought approximately 320 acres from the Bledsoe family. Isaac Bledsoe was one of the first owners of the property on which Cragfont was built. He nor his family ever lived on the property or took advantage of the lick. European settlers settled on the lick as market hunters and hunted the wildlife in high volumes to sell in the European markets. Their hunting was so excessive that in the 3 to 4 months they would stay, they would nearly wipe out an entire species living there. James Winchester purchased the Cragfont property in 1793. He initially built a fort on the property called Fort Tuckahoe before building the Cragfont mansion we know today. He lived at Cragfont with his wife Susan and their 12 children. I'd now like to tell you a little bit about Susan Winchester. She was born Susan Black in November of 1776 in South Carolina, which was one of the 13 original colonies. She grew up as part of the frontier family. She did not come from a wealthy family. Susan married James Winchester and raised 12 children with a 30-year gap from their first and last child. She lived through a lot of history, including the American Revolution, the Civil War, statehood of Tennessee, the Mexican-American War, and the War of 1812. She actually lived long enough to have her photo taken and was the longest of the Winchesters to live in the Cragfont home. James Winchester was born on February 6, 1752 in Carroll County, Maryland. He arrived in Middle Tennessee before statehood in 1785 with his brother George. Their father came from England in the early 1700s as an indentured servant, but quickly built wealth through land speculating. James did not inherit a significant amount of wealth from his father, but his father's background in land speculation did help propel James into his future career as a land speculator. James could have easily been considered a jack of many trades, as we would call it today. In order to build and maintain a mansion the size of Cragfont required a great deal of wealth, and James had many outlets for obtaining and maintaining this wealth throughout his lifetime. He was a land speculator, an investor in mercantilism, served in the military, and a slave trader. As a veteran, James served in both the American Revolution and the War of 1812. He served under George Washington on the Continental Line throughout the entirety of the American Revolution. As a land speculator, he bought and sold land very early on and in large amounts. This was a quick way to earn wealth back then. His father's history as a land speculator likely gave him an advantage in this industry. As an investor, he invested in mercantilism. He owned many stores and factories along with the inventory. He invested in flatboats and later on steamboats. He traded slaves through his mercantile stores and also throughout his boat business. In the War of 1812, James Winchester was one of the key leaders during the Battle of Frenchtown. These Americans were fighting the British and their Native American allies because the British were supplying the Indians with weapons and supplies. After the British and Indians attacked Winchester's camp on January 22, 1813, he offered to surrender due to being outnumbered. However, the following day, the Indians and British killed wounded Americans and burned down their homes. Winchester attempted to retaliate with the limited soldiers and resources he had left, but this only resulted in more deaths among his diminishing army. The British commander, Colonel Proctor, and James Winchester agreed to stop killing, but the Indians continued to massacre his men. Winchester wasn't able to escape with his remaining men. He was captured and imprisoned in Canada for a year. When James was released from prison, he served as state commissioner for Tennessee, in which he patrolled the Mississippi and Tennessee borders. The War of 1812 was only one of the many encounters that James had with the Native American Indians. In fact, James had been battling them since he first claimed the Cragfont property in 1785. When James and his brother George first arrived in Sumner County in 1785, they illegally settled on the land of Cragfont, which was occupied by Native Americans at the time, and built a fort they called Fort Tuckahoe. This blatant disregard for Native Americans, which was common for white colonists, led to many conflicts and tension. These conflicts led to multiple casualties on both sides, and many of the skirmishes took place on Cragfont's property. On July 9, 1974, George Winchester left Bledsoe's Lick en route to the Sumner County Courthouse when he was killed and scalped by Native Americans. Even though James's brother was one of the last casualties associated with the battle for Cragfont's property, it did not change what happened to the Native Americans who resided here and the substantial loss they suffered. Cragfont represents a place of sadness and loss to these Native Americans. They lost another piece of their identity here. They lost more land, and they lost their quality of life with the property's convenient access to Bledsoe's Lick and Creek. Apart from that, this place represents another landmark in Tennessee that represents the annihilation of their culture. The morning after George's death, James ordered the pursuit of the individual responsible for killing him. After 2 weeks of no successful leads, they returned and James wrote the following message. Dear General, on the melancholy and unfortunate fall of my brother George, I ordered Captain Blackmere with about 50 mounted militia to pursue the trail if possible until he came up with them. He has just returned after a long and fatiguing march of near 2 weeks without effecting anything. On this unhappy occasion, I rather attended to my own feelings as a man and a brother than to my duty as an officer and soldier. I, however, trust and hope that if it is in your power, you will permit me to have these men mustered and let them be paid for their services. Although James's conflict with Native Americans began over the valuable land of Cragfont, it's important to note that his brother's death likely fueled James's motivation to fight them in the War of 1812. Ultimately, James won the battle in the end, as he lived and thrived in this prestigious mansion called Cragfont and remained wealthy throughout his entire life. However, Cragfont will continue to serve as a lasting reminder of what this beautiful place costed the Native Americans: their identity, their land, their quality of life, and their culture. Elmira Winchester was the sixth child of James and Susan Winchester, and she was born in 1805. She wrote in a diary from 1823 to 1824 as a 17-year-old teenager, and her very descriptive writing has allowed historians to get a view of what life at Cragfont was like. Her diary is so specific in detail, they've been able to narrow down which bedroom she stayed in, her routine, and purpose for the other rooms in the house. The photo to the right is of Elmira at 65 years old and is the only surviving photo of her today. Elmira spoke about the parlor frequently in her journal, as this was a room that she spent a lot of her time and is also in the front of the house. The Holston Road can be seen directly from the parlor's window, and she mentions seeing many guests coming and going along this main road in her journal. Elmira also explained that she watched the mist rise from the Bledsoe Creek to the front of the house. This revealed to historians that Bledsoe Creek was once visible from this window, and her view was much different from the view that we see today. Elmira mentions the library frequently in her journal as well. She explains this was used as a multi-purpose room or as an additional hosting space when they had extra company over. This is also where Elmira documented she ate her breakfast most often. Because Elmira didn't mention her father's office in her journal, historians have had a difficult time narrowing down exactly how James used this room. We do know that the book lying on the table to the right belongs to James and was his original day book from 1823 to 1825. Elmira wrote the most about her bedroom, as this is where she spent most of her time. She documented that she stayed up late and ate midnight snacks, enjoyed going for long walks, and reading many books. She wrote about waking up around 1 p.m. in the afternoon only because the sun was hitting her in the face. She explained that she shared this room with her sisters and even noted her dislike of playing cards when they invited her to play a game. Her day-to-day lifestyle was very unique and certainly speaks volumes of her wealth. The most significant aspect of her journal is what's missing in her daily routine, which is work. She only mentioned working with her hands twice in the year that she journaled. The remainder of her journal entries detail leisure activities. This speaks of the work the enslaved were doing for her, although she does not mention them once in her journal. According to historical documentation, it's likely that James and his brother George had slaves when they arrived on the western frontier in 1785. The first record of them buying a slave in Sumner County was on July 3rd, 1788. They purchased a 15-year-old boy named Dan at this time. Approximately 1 year later, documents reveal James purchased a 19-year-old woman named Amy and her 13-month-old child for $300, which is the equivalent of $9,000 in 2020. There is no way to know exactly how many enslaved workers helped build Cragfont or how many worked for the Winchesters when it was completed in 1802. Historians don't have an exact number of slaves James owned or traded throughout his life, but they do know that he had 26 enslaved workers at the time of his death in 1826. The list to the right includes the 26 enslaved individuals that worked at Cragfont and were only documented because they were part of his will and probate, meaning that these individuals were considered part of his inventory. Historians know little about these individuals because it was illegal to document or mention them otherwise. To the right, you'll see their age, their name, and the price at which they could be resold. The final price at the bottom is so complete because this document was a final total of James's inventory. The inventory explained the amount each person could be sold for or collectively as a whole. The enslaved workers at Cragfont primarily worked in the home or doing a trade since agriculture did not thrive on the land. Their workday consisted of long hours doing rigorous work that served the interests of the wealthy Winchesters, and they had little, if any, downtime for themselves. They lived in small, subpar cabins on the property, with multiple people living in a single cabin, and were only given the very basics to survive, such as a fireplace or garden plot. These cabins did not survive throughout time, and historians are still searching for their exact location today. Because the enslaved were treated as property and not people, very little is known about them, and there is little mention of them in historical documentation, although they were the primary workers upholding the Winchesters' lifestyle and doing the hard work to maintain such a place as Cragfont. Historians have learned some about the work the enslaved individuals performed at Cragfont. For example, Delphi worked as the cook, Prince worked as a shoemaker, carpenter, and made barrels, Dave worked as a blacksmith, and Fleming worked in the smokehouse. Historians know the most about Delphi than any of the other enslaved workers at Cragfont, as she is mentioned the most frequently in historical documentation. She was born around 1807 and was about 2 years younger than Almira. She worked for the Winchesters for 2 generations in approximately 40 years. She was incredibly talented as a cook and a baker, known especially for her biscuits, ham, and coffee. Delphi had an incredibly taxing job working in the kitchen at Cragfont. She worked many long hours over an open fire, which was incredibly hot and had little smoke ventilation in the room. She prepared meals for both the Winchesters and their guests. Making something as simple as coffee was an extensive process. The Winchesters ordered name brand green coffee beans, and Delphi had to roast them over the open fire each week. Delphi spent all of her time in this space and didn't get much of a break at night since Elmira was up late having Delphi prepare snacks for her, as she documented in her journal. The kitchen space was not just Delphi's workspace, but was also her living quarters. She lived in the loft above the kitchen, shown here to the right, which is directly across the room from the open fire pit, shown in the previous slide. The first thing to note about her loft is the height. It was only 3 foot high, ceiling to floor, and was certainly an inadequate living space for a human. This loft was designed only for sleeping, while the remainder of her time was spent cooking in the kitchen. The second thing to note is the beam condition. It's difficult to see in the upper image, but The wall and the beams inside her loft were black from the buildup of smoke and creosote from the fire. Because smoke from the fire rose, it infiltrated her loft, and Delphi had to sleep in this small, smoky space. She did not get a break from these harsh conditions, especially since she cooked Elmira late-night snacks frequently. Delphi was the only enslaved individual to live within the Winchester's house, which, as you could see, did not come with extra privilege but more disadvantage. George Winchester passed away July 26th of 1826, and he of course left the house to his wife Susan until she died in 1864. After she passed away, their youngest son George inherited the property. However, George enlisted in the Confederate Army and was captured, so his wife Melvina was left responsible for the property. Melvina lived at Cragfont with her children and approximately 30 enslaved workers. At this time, the Union began to take control of the surrounding counties and enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, which granted freedom to all of the enslaved in Confederate states and territories won from the war. One morning, Melvina woke up and realized that routine tasks performed by the enslaved individuals were incomplete. So she searched for them only to find that all of the slaves had left together in the middle of the night. They walked 6 miles from Cragfont to Gallatin, which was now under Union control, to claim their freedom granted by the Emancipation Proclamation. The ages of the enslaved individuals who gained their freedom that night ranged from 2 to 70 years old. Delphi was among those who had left and was 70 years old when she finally found freedom. Historians have been able to trace many of the enslaved individuals who left Cragfont. They know many went to live in a community about 3 miles from the property after they were freed. Fleming, William, and Washington were among those verified at this location. However, historians lost track of Delphi after she gained her freedom, likely because she passed away due to old age. The Winchester family owned Cragfont until 1866 when they lost it after the Civil War. It then went through 6 owners from 1866 to 1958, all of which planned to restore the home but never began the process. By the time the state bought it in 1958, it was dilapidated and used as a barn. Today, Cragfont has been restored and is open for tours as one of Tennessee's historical landmarks. Although it's easy to marvel over the elegance and intricate beauty Cragfont brings forth in our present time, it's important to remember that this place came with a significant cost for Native Americans, who sacrificed their lives for this property and lost everything in the process. It's also important to remember that this mansion was built upon and maintained by the stolen labor of individuals who were treated like property rather than people and never got to partake in the luxuries of living in this place. May we never forget or dismiss such times as these in our history, and may we always strive to ensure each individual's worth is equal and always valued.